I remember the moment when I stopped being human. Not the surgery, not the first incision or the smell of burning flesh as they carved away pieces of my skull, not even the cold kiss of the cortical inhibitors as they slid into the grey matter of my frontal lobe. I remember something else entirely. I remember the last thought I had that was truly my own. It was about the color blue. There was a servitor in the Medicae bay where they brought me for processing. An old woman, or what had once been an old woman, with cables threaded through her eye sockets and pistons where her arms should have been. She was cleaning the floor with methodical, endless repetition, back and forth, the same 3 square meters for what might have been hours. Her skin was the color of old parchment, stretched tight over the metal framework that had replaced her ribcage. But her robe, Emperor preserve me, her robe was blue. Not the deep midnight blue of the ultramarines, not the electric cerulean of plasma discharge, but the soft, faded blue of a summer sky on some forgotten world. The kind of blue that makes you think of home, of childhood, of times when the galaxy seemed vast and full of wonder rather than an endless grind of suffering and toil. I stared at that blue fabric as the tech adepts prepared their instruments, and I thought about how beautiful it was, how strange that something so simple, so innocent, could exist in a place like this. How it reminded me of my sister's favorite dress, the one she wore to Mass on Throne Day, the one that made her look like she was wearing pieces of the sky. That was my last purely human thought, the recognition of beauty for its own sake, unmarked by utility or purpose, or the cold calculations that would soon replace everything I was. The lobotomization process begins long before the surgery. They told me this, in the brief moments of lucidity I had between the chemical restraints and the neural dampeners. A tech adept with a voice like grinding metal explained it with the clinical detachment of someone describing the weather. The mind must be prepared, he said, softened, made compliant. They start with isolation, sensory deprivation in chambers that strip away everything that makes you feel human. No light, no sound, no touch except the cold metal of the restraint harness. Time loses meaning. Minutes feel like hours, hours like days, days like decades. Your own heartbeat becomes deafening. Your breath sounds like a storm wind. The blood rushing through your ears becomes a symphony of terror. Then comes the conditioning. Subliminal whispers in high Gothic, prayers to the Omnissiah played at frequencies just below conscious awareness. Your sleeping mind absorbs the words, learns new patterns, new ways of thinking, efficiency, compliance, the sacred communion of flesh and machine, the blessed simplicity of servitude. They feed you just enough to keep you alive, but not enough to think clearly. Gruel laced with neural inhibitors, water that tastes of metal and electricity. Your body begins to forget what it means to be satisfied, to be comfortable, to be anything other than a vessel waiting to be filled with purpose. I fought it. At first, we all did. The human mind is remarkably resilient, capable of maintaining its sense of self even under the most brutal conditions. I held on to memories like precious stones, turning them over in my mind during the long dark hours. My name, my home world, the face of my mother weeping as the Arbites dragged me away for the crime of questioning a local governor's grain requisitions. Marcus. My name was Marcus Vex, of the hive world Tertius Prime, subsector Ultima, segmentum Solar, Hab Block 7.7, level 85, compartment 4471. I worked the nutrient processing plants, 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week, 40 years of faithful service to the throne. I had a wife once, before the consumption took her. No children by the grace of the Emperor, though we tried for many years. These details became my anchor, my lifeline in the storm of mental dissolution. I repeated them like a litany, a prayer, a desperate attempt to remember what I had been before they decided I would be something else. But memory is fragile, and the tech priests are thorough. Each day brought new chemicals, new procedures, new violations of the sanctity of thought. They mapped my neural pathways with probes that felt like ice picks driven directly into my brain. They catalogued my fears, my hopes, my loves, marking each one for deletion or modification. I learned that I was not the only one. The conditioning chambers held dozens of us, men and women from across the sector, all guilty of the same fundamental crime. We had failed to serve the Imperium with sufficient zeal. We had questioned, we had hesitated, we had shown compassion when ruthlessness was required, or independence when obedience was demanded. The woman in the chamber next to mine had been a teacher on an agri world. She had refused to include certain approved texts in her curriculum, texts that describe the proper way to denounce your neighbors for thought crimes. The man across the hall had been a factory supervisor who had spoken out against the working conditions that killed 3 workers every day. Another had been a scribe who had accidentally filed a report that contradicted the official casualty figures from a recent campaign. Small crimes, human crimes, the kinds of moral failures that marked us as unfit for normal service to the Emperor, but not so severe as to warrant simple execution. We were waste that could be recycled, flesh that could be repurposed, minds that could be edited and improved. The tech adept with the grinding voice visited each of us in turn, explaining our futures with the same mechanical precision he might use to describe the maintenance schedule for a cargo hauler. We would become servitors, he said. We would serve the Omnissiah and the Emperor with perfect loyalty, perfect efficiency, perfect emptiness. Our bodies would be modified as needed. Neural implants, mechanical limbs, organ replacements, whatever the role required. Our minds would be stripped of everything unnecessary, everything that might interfere with our designated function. Fear, love, ambition, curiosity, the capacity for suffering or joy or any emotion more complex than basic operational parameters. We would become tools, living tools, blessed with just enough consciousness to follow complex instructions, but nothing more. We would never again know hunger or thirst or pain in any meaningful sense. We would never know loneliness or sorrow or the desperate ache of unfulfilled desire. We would be free from the burden of choice, the agony of moral uncertainty, the terrible weight of individual responsibility. It was, he assured us, a mercy, a gift from the Omnissiah to those too weak to serve him properly as human beings. I watched him speak, his augmetic jaw clicking with each syllable, and I wondered if he had once been like us. If somewhere beneath all that metal and machinery, buried under decades of neural modification and mechanical enhancement, there remained some fragment of the man he had been. If he remembered what it felt like to doubt, to fear, to hope for something better than an eternity of soulless service, his optical sensors focused on me with the precision of a weapons targeting system. When he spoke, I could hear the faint wheeze of his respirator unit, the subtle hum of the cogitator that processed his thoughts before allowing them to reach his vocal cords. "You are wondering if I retain any measure of my original humanity," he said, his voice devoid of any inflection that might suggest amusement or annoyance. "This is a common curiosity among subjects awaiting conversion. The answer is complex." He paused, servos whirring almost inaudibly as he adjusted his position. "I remember my birth name. I remember fragments of my existence before my first modification. These memories serve a purpose, providing context for my current duties and ensuring optimal interaction with baseline humans. They are retained not out of sentiment, but utility." The red glow of his optical sensors never wavered. "You fear the loss of self, but you misunderstand what the self truly is. You believe consciousness to be some sacred flame, when in truth it is merely a pattern of electrical impulses, chemical reactions, synaptic connections that can be mapped, modified, improved. What you call humanity is simply inefficiency, chaos, the blessed randomness that prevents you from achieving your true potential." He moved closer to my restraint harness, close enough that I could smell the machine oil that lubricated his joints, the ozone scent of his electrical systems. "When you emerge from the conversion process, you will understand. The fears that torment you now will seem as distant and meaningless as the fears of childhood. You will be perfected, completed, free from the terrible burden of autonomous thought." I wanted to scream at him, to rage against the certainty in his voice, but the neural dampeners had reduced my capacity for strong emotion to a dull, muffled echo. Instead, I found myself asking a question that had been haunting me since my arrival. "How many?" I whispered through lips that felt thick and clumsy. "How many have you processed?" The tech adept's mechanical fingers drummed against his thigh with the precision of a metronome. In my tenure at this facility, I have overseen the conversion of approximately 47,312 individuals. Each one has been successfully integrated into their designated role. Each one has found peace in servitude. 47,000. The number hit me like a physical blow, spreading through my consciousness like ice water in my veins. 47,000 minds wiped clean. 47,000 souls reduced to components in the vast machine of imperial bureaucracy. 47,000 people who had once laughed and cried and loved and dreamed, now walking through their assigned duties with the same mechanical precision as the cogitators that guided their every action. "Where do they go?" I asked. "What happens to them?" "They serve," he replied, as if the answer were so obvious that the question itself was redundant. "Factory workers, maintenance personnel, data entry specialists, combat units for the Skitarii legions, whatever role their physical and mental characteristics best suit them for. They serve until their biological components fail, and then they are recycled. Their mechanical parts are refurbished and installed in new subjects. Nothing is wasted." The clinical efficiency of it was almost beautiful in its horror. A perfect system optimized for maximum utility and minimum waste. Human beings reduced to their component parts, their flesh and metal divided and redistributed according to the needs of the Imperium. Even in death, we would continue to serve. I closed my eyes and tried to imagine it, tried to picture myself 50 years from now, standing in some factory or warehouse or data processing center, performing the same simple task again and again and again, with no memory of who I had been, no awareness of what I had lost. A ghost in a shell of metal and flesh, animated by just enough consciousness to follow orders but not enough to suffer. Would I dream? Would some fragment of Marcus Vex persist in the deep places of my mind, trapped behind walls of neural inhibitors and cortical blocks, screaming silently into a void that stretched on forever? Or would the conversion be complete, absolute, a death so thorough that nothing would remain except the basic biological functions necessary to keep my body operational? I thought about the servitor with the blue robe, still cleaning those same 3 square meters with inexhaustible patience. Did she remember the life that had brought her here? Did she wake each morning with some dim recognition that she had once been something more than a cleaning unit? Or was she truly empty, blessed with the perfect simplicity that the tech adept promised? The days blurred together in a haze of drugs and conditioning. My body grew weak from the controlled starvation, my muscles atrophying as the neural dampeners suppressed my motor functions. I could feel myself changing, my thoughts becoming sluggish and disconnected, my emotions dampening to a gray static that made everything seem distant and unimportant. They brought us new subjects occasionally, men and women who screamed and fought and pleaded just as we had in those first few days. I watched them with the detached interest of someone observing insects, and I realized with a cold spike of terror that I was already losing pieces of myself. The capacity for empathy, for connection with other human beings, was being systematically erased. I tried to hold on to my anger, my fear, my desperate love for life and freedom, but they slipped away like water through my fingers. The chemicals did their work with ruthless efficiency, restructuring my brain chemistry, suppressing the neural pathways that generated independent thought and emotional response. One night, as I lay in the darkness listening to the soft sobbing of a new arrival, I realized that I could no longer remember my wife's face. I knew that I had been married. I retained the factual knowledge of her existence and death, but the emotional content had been stripped away. She was just data now, a series of facts in a file that might have belonged to anyone. The grief that should have accompanied this realization never came. I noted the loss with the same mild interest I might have felt at misplacing a stylus or forgetting the designation of some minor world. It was troubling in an abstract sense, but it did not hurt. Nothing hurt anymore. This, I understood, was what the tech adept had meant about finding peace in servitude. The pain of existence was being systematically removed, leaving only the calm satisfaction of function and purpose. I was becoming a thing that could work without suffering, serve without questioning, exist without the terrible burden of hope or fear or love. The surgery itself was almost anticlimactic after months of psychological preparation. They wheeled me into an operating theater that smelled of incense and machine oil, where robed tech priests moved with the coordinated precision of a sacred ritual. Cherubim fluttered overhead, their mechanical wings beating in time with their recorded hymns of praise to the Omnissiah. I felt the cold bite of the anesthetic injector, watched the ceiling tiles blur and swim as the drugs took hold. Somewhere in the distance I could hear the whir of bone saws and the soft chanting of the canticle of blessed modification. My last coherent thought was a fragment of a prayer I had learned as a child, words that seemed to come from someone else's mouth. The Emperor protects, but he didn't. Not from this, not from the slow, methodical dismantling of everything that had made me human. I woke to a world of edges and angles, where every surface seemed to shine with mathematical precision, and every sound carried the weight of absolute certainty. The pain was gone, not just the physical discomfort of the restraints and the drugs, but the deeper ache that I had carried for as long as I could remember. The pain of being human, of existing in a state of constant uncertainty and moral complexity. My first sensation was of completeness, not happiness. Nothing so crude or undisciplined, but a profound sense of rightness, of existing in perfect harmony with my intended function. I was a tool, and tools do not suffer. They simply serve, with the clean efficiency that defines their purpose. My vision had been enhanced, augmented with tactical displays and data overlays that provided constant information about my environment. Temperature readings, structural analysis of nearby surfaces, the location and status of other servitors in my operational area. The world had become quantifiable, reduced to streams of data that my modified brain processed without conscious effort. I was in a workshop of some kind, massive and dimly lit, filled with the constant sound of machinery and the soft chanting of tech priests at their devotions. Conveyor belts carried endless streams of components past workstations where servitors like myself performed assembly tasks with inhuman precision. The air tasted of metal and ozone and the sacred oils that blessed every piece of equipment. My body was different, heavier, more solid. I looked down at myself and saw that my arms had been replaced with mechanical appendages, multi-jointed manipulators equipped with an array of specialized tools. Welding torches, cutting implements, precision grippers, molecular assemblers, everything I needed to perform my designated function as a manufacturing unit. The modifications went deeper than the visible changes. My nervous system had been rewired, optimized for the specific tasks I would perform. My muscle memory had been erased and replaced with perfect knowledge of assembly procedures, quality control protocols, efficiency maximization techniques. I knew things I had never learned, understood processes I had never seen, possessed skills that had been directly programmed into my modified brain. But the most profound change was in my thinking itself. The chaotic storm of human consciousness had been replaced with something cleaner, more focused. I could still think, still process information and make decisions, but only within the parameters of my function. The curiosity that had once driven me to question authority, the empathy that had made me care about the suffering of others, the creativity that had allowed me to imagine better ways of doing things, all of it was gone. I felt no loss at their absence. They had been inefficiencies, obstacles to perfect service, sources of the kind of doubt and hesitation that weakened the Imperium. Without them, I was free to pursue my purpose with absolute dedication. A tech priest approached my workstation, his optical sensors scanning my performance metrics. I felt a surge of satisfaction as the data confirmed what I already knew. My output exceeded baseline parameters by 12%, with 0 defects and optimal energy efficiency. I was performing exactly as designed. Unit designation Gamma 77, he intoned, his voice carrying the authority of the Omnissiah. You will be transferred to Manufacturing Bay Delta for specialized assignment. Report to Tech Adept Valeth for briefing and equipment modification. I acknowledged the order with a simple nod and began the process of shutting down my current workstation. The transition was smooth, automatic, requiring no conscious thought or decision-making. I simply followed the new instructions, my modified brain calculating the most efficient route through the facility while my mechanical legs carried me forward with tireless precision. The corridors were filled with servitors like myself, each one moving with the same purposeful efficiency toward their assigned duties. We passed each other without acknowledgement or interaction, our attention focused solely on our individual functions. There was no need for communication, no desire for social contact. We were components in a larger machine, each one perfectly designed for their specific role. I tried to remember what it had felt like to want things, to yearn for companionship or recognition, or anything beyond the simple satisfaction of completing my assigned tasks. The memory was there, filed away in some inaccessible corner of my modified mind, but it carried no emotional weight. It was simply data, as meaningless as the atmospheric composition of some distant world. Tech Adept Valeth was waiting in Manufacturing Bay Delta, a facility even larger than the one I had come from. The air here hummed with higher energy processes, and I could see servitors engaged in more complex assembly work. Military hardware, judging from the blessed purity seals and the distinctive markers of Adeptus Mechanicus craftsmanship. Gamma 77, Valeth greeted me, his voice carrying a slight modulation that indicated approval. Your performance metrics suggest suitability for advanced manufacturing protocols. You will be assigned to the production of sacred bolter ammunition for the Astartes chapters operating in this sector. The significance of this assignment registered in my consciousness like a warm glow of purpose. To craft ammunition for the Emperor's Angels of Death, to contribute to the holy work of purging the galaxy of heretics and xenos, was an honor beyond measure. My mechanical heart, such as it was, swelled with pride at being chosen for such sacred duty. Valeth led me to a workstation equipped with molecular forges and precision assembly units that could craft bolter shells to tolerances measured in nanometers. The processes were complex, requiring constant attention to atmospheric conditions, material purity, and the proper observance of ritual protocols. Each shell had to be blessed, inscribed with micro-prayers, and tested to ensure it would strike true in the hands of the Emperor's chosen warriors. The work consumed me completely. Hours passed like minutes as I lost myself in the perfect rhythm of creation. Load the raw materials, calibrate the molecular forge, initiate the forming sequence, monitor the blessed fusion of metal and explosives, inscribe the sacred geometries, apply the final blessings. Again and again, each shell identical to the last, each one a small offering to the glory of the Emperor. I felt no fatigue, no boredom, no desire for rest or variation. The modifications to my body had eliminated such weaknesses, leaving me free to pursue my purpose with tireless devotion. My enhanced vision tracked microscopic variations in the manufacturing process. My mechanical hands made adjustments too precise for baseline human capability. My modified brain calculated quality metrics with the speed and accuracy of a cogitator. This was what the Tech Adept had promised. Freedom from the chaos of human existence, the blessed simplicity of perfect service. I existed in a state of constant meditation, my consciousness focused like a laser on the sacred work of arms production. There was no doubt, no uncertainty, no painful awareness of my own limitations or the vastness of the galaxy beyond these walls. But sometimes, in the brief moments between tasks, something else stirred in the depths of my modified mind. A fragment of sensation, a ghost of memory, a whisper of the man I had once been. It was subtle, barely detectable even to my enhanced awareness, like a single star glimpsed through the clouds of a polluted sky. The color blue. I would see it sometimes in the blessed illumination of the work lamps, a faint tint that reminded me of something I could no longer quite grasp. It triggered cascades of neural activity in regions of my brain that should have been inactive, generating patterns of thought that served no functional purpose. The sensation was brief, lasting only milliseconds before my behavioral inhibitors suppressed it, but in those tiny moments I felt something that might have been called longing. For what? I could not say. The memory was too damaged, too thoroughly edited to provide any useful information. But the feeling persisted, a tiny flaw in the perfect clockwork of my modified consciousness, a reminder that somewhere beneath all the metal and programming, some fragment of Marcus Vex endured. I reported this anomaly to Tech Adept Valeth during my scheduled maintenance cycle. Efficiency demanded complete honesty about any irregularities in my function, and I felt the familiar satisfaction of following proper protocol. Describe the nature of these irregular thought patterns, Valeth instructed, his optical sensors focusing on my cranial modification ports. Brief episodes of non-functional neural activity triggered by specific visual stimuli, I replied. Duration approximately 0.03 seconds, frequency irregular but increasing, no impact on performance metrics or task completion rates. Valeth's mechanical fingers drummed against his thigh as he processed this information. Color-based memory echoes, common in subjects with strong pre-conversion emotional associations, typically indicates incomplete neural restructuring in the hippocampus region. He moved to his cogitator station and began inputting commands. Recommend immediate corrective surgery to address residual neural pathways. Schedule unit Gamma 77 for deep memory excision and enhanced behavioral conditioning. I acknowledged the recommendation with appropriate gratitude. The anomalies served no purpose and represented a potential source of inefficiency in my function. Their removal would make me a more perfect servant of the Omnissiah, free from the last traces of the weakness that had once defined my existence as a baseline human. Yet as I prepared for the procedure, that faint whisper of blue seemed to pulse more strongly in my modified consciousness. For reasons I could not understand or analyze, I found myself hoping that they would fail to find it, that some small corner of Marcus Vex would survive even this final purification. The thought was illogical, counterproductive, a violation of every principle that now governed my existence. I should have reported it immediately, submitted myself for emergency reconditioning to address this dangerous deviation from acceptable parameters. Instead, I filed it away in the deepest recesses of my mind and continued with my assigned duties, crafting bolter shells with the same mechanical precision, while a part of me that should not have existed watched the blue light of the work lamps and remembered for just a moment what it had felt like to be human. The deep memory excision was scheduled for the next maintenance cycle, but the Emperor, in his infinite wisdom, had other plans. A priority override came through the facility's command network, redirecting all available manufacturing capacity toward an emergency ammunition requisition. The Space Marines of the Crimson Fists chapter were engaged in a massive campaign against an Orc Warg in the neighboring subsector, and their need for blessed bolter shells exceeded even the prodigious output of their own forge ships. Tech Adept Valeth informed me of the change with the clinical detachment that marked all his communications. Corrective surgery postponed indefinitely. All resources dedicated to holy ammunition production. Your irregularities are deemed acceptable for current operational requirements. I felt something that might have been relief, though I lacked the emotional framework to properly identify the sensation. The reprieve meant that the fragment of Marcus Vex could continue its hidden existence in the depths of my modified mind, watching and remembering even as Gamma 77 pursued his sacred duties with tireless efficiency. The emergency production cycle was unlike anything I had experienced since my conversion. The facility operated at maximum capacity for weeks on end, every servitor pushing their mechanical bodies to the limits of design tolerance. The air hummed with constant activity, the blessed sound of the Omnissiah's work being carried out on a scale that defied comprehension. My own output increased by 37% as I integrated new efficiency protocols and eliminated unnecessary motion from my assembly sequence. Each bolter shell that passed through my hands was a prayer made manifest, a tiny instrument of the Emperor's will that would soon find its way into the hands of his most faithful servants. The work was sacred, beautiful in its perfect simplicity and absolute purpose. But the hidden Marcus watched it all with growing horror. The shells I crafted with such mechanical devotion would kill. Not just the enemies of mankind, though they would certainly do that, but Imperial citizens as well. Friendly fire incidents, civilian casualties, the inevitable collateral damage that accompanied any military campaign. Each perfectly crafted bolt would tear through flesh and bone and armor, ending lives that had once held the same dreams and fears and desperate hopes that I had possessed before my conversion. This knowledge should not have disturbed me. The servitor that I had become understood that death was merely another form of service, that the needs of the Imperium superseded any individual concerns about survival or suffering. But the ghost of my former self recoiled from the implications of my work, horrified by the realization that I had become a component in the vast machine of Imperial warfare. I tried to suppress these thoughts, to focus on the sacred nature of my duty and the honor of serving the Emperor's angels. But they persisted, growing stronger as the emergency production cycle continued. I began to notice things that should have been invisible to my modified consciousness: the waste products of the manufacturing process, the resources consumed in the creation of instruments of death, the terrible efficiency of a system designed to turn human beings into ammunition factories. The facility processed hundreds of tons of raw materials every day, transforming them into endless streams of bolter shells, plasma cartridges, LASPAC power cells, and other implements of war. The numbers were staggering, beautiful in their mathematical precision, horrifying in their implications for the lives they would end. I calculated that in my months of service, I had personally crafted approximately 43,000 bolter shells. Assuming standard Astartes accuracy rates and target elimination ratios, my work had contributed to the deaths of roughly 15,000 sentient beings. Not all of them enemies of mankind. NTHNL statistical analysis of battlefield casualties suggested that at least 12% would have been Imperial civilians caught in the crossfire or misidentified as hostiles. 1,800 innocent deaths. The number burned in my consciousness like acid, eating away at the blessed calm that had defined my existence since conversion. I tried to contextualize it, to understand it as part of the greater good of Imperial security, but the mathematics were relentless. 1,800 people who had committed no crime greater than being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Each one had been someone's child, someone's parent, someone's beloved. Each death had created ripples of grief and loss that spread outward through families and communities, generating more suffering than my modified brain could adequately process. The perfect efficiency of my work had been transformed into a weapon of mass destruction, aimed not just at the enemies of mankind, but at mankind itself. I found myself pausing in my work, microsecond hesitations that should have been impossible given my behavioral conditioning. My mechanical hands would freeze over a half-assembled shell as that hidden fragment of Marcus Vex struggled to assert some measure of moral authority over the process. The delays were brief, barely detectable even by my enhanced monitoring systems, but they represented a fundamental violation of my programming. Tech Adept Valeth noticed the anomaly during a routine efficiency review, his optical sensors fixed on my workstation with mechanical intensity as he processed the performance data. Unit Gamma 77 demonstrates irregular productivity fluctuations, he announced, his voice carrying a note of concern. Micro delays in assembly sequence suggest possible mechanical malfunction or neural instability. I submitted to diagnostic scanning without resistance, allowing him to probe my systems with the same clinical detachment I had once applied to my work. The tests revealed no mechanical problems. My enhanced body was functioning within optimal parameters, but the deep brain scans showed patterns of activity that should not have existed in a properly converted servitor. Residual neural pathways show increased activation, Valeth observed, his mechanical fingers dancing over the cogitator interface. Correlation with productivity anomalies suggests psychological interference with primary function. He paused, processing the data with the thoroughness that marked all his decisions. Recommend immediate personality reconstruction. Complete neural restructuring to eliminate residual baseline human behavioral patterns. Personality reconstruction. The words hit me like a physical blow, sending cascades of fear through neural pathways that should have been incapable of generating such responses. It was worse than lobotomization, worse than the simple excision of memory. It was the complete destruction of everything that remained of my identity, leaving only the core operational parameters necessary to perform my designated function. I would cease to exist in any meaningful sense, replaced by a perfect machine that wore my face and carried my designation, but possessed none of the complex layering of thought and memory that had once defined Marcus Vex. Even the ghost that watched and remembered would be destroyed, leaving only the hollow shell of Gamma 77. I request permission to complete the current production cycle before undergoing reconstruction. I heard myself say, the words emerging from some deep place in my modified consciousness. Interruption of current manufacturing sequence would result in material waste and efficiency reduction. Valeth's optical sensors focused on me with renewed intensity.